My name is Andrew Gearson. I'm really excited to do this with you guys today. A little about me. I know you've presumably read about my background on the website, but as of last year, starting from then until 2016, I was working at Silent Arm Management as a creative executive. So we were, signing lots of young writers, and that's actually how I got introduced to roadmap writers originally, and was also very much involved in giving notes on client projects while I was there, as well as going to film festivals and doing all of that. Late last year, I left Silent Art to begin my own writing career, and since then, I've also still been working with roadmap writers, consulting, and this will be my first webinar. In addition to that, I've also been consulting a little bit for Final Draft's Big Break competition, which is a screenwriting competition, so I feel very familiar with that space. And when we get to the Q&A portion, I'm happy to take questions about sci-fi, but also management-related questions or things about screenwriting competitions. I also would be happy to answer those. And then, as Brianna mentioned, I'm actually quarantining with one of the writers of Amazon's Upload. Her name is Mary Galino. She wrote episode 3 of Upload called The Funeral. So if you haven't, go check out the show. It's great. And yeah, if you want to take this time to also come up with some questions for her, that would be welcome. So I guess I'll start by just talking a little bit about why I wanted to do this webinar. Ever since I was a kid, I read a ton, and I was always really into fantasy stuff, a little bit of, spy things as well. But then as I got older, all of that began to feel like a little bit unrealistic, and somehow sci-fi felt more realistic to me because it was, rooted in science. And it's always been a really big passion of mine since I decided to get into the industry. And so I'm really excited to explore that with you today, and hopefully teach you something new. So let's get into it. So how we define sci-fi. If you ask film critics, they'll have some pretty wordy explanations. Here's Vivian Sobchak's definition of sci-fi. I'll let you read that for a second. As you can see, there's a lot of good words here associated with science fiction and sort of the connection between science and almost a sort of magic or religious element that we kind of see in the genre in general. That being said, I think this is a pretty complicated way of putting it. More simply, science fiction is the genre including any work using, science that isn't exactly real. So that ends up being a really wide definition. As you can see, we have very different movies here. We have a very, very big blockbuster in the Avengers. And obviously that ties in a lot to that sort of mythical element, considering that some of the stuff in there is not exactly science-based. We also have Alien, which is obviously a classic horror thriller movie with, not exactly realistic science either, but maybe a little less crazy than the Avengers. And then Eternal Sunshine, which is a film that I absolutely adore and is much more in our world, but of course has some pretty radical elements to it. So these are all sci-fi. Really, sci-fi is one of the broadest genres because all you need is a tiny element that involves something that's almost sort of mystical to be considered sci-fi. So, in some ways I would almost argue that it's less of a genre like, a Western or a thriller or horror or drama or romance, and more of like a setting. But for the purpose of this webinar, we'll continue to sort of call it a genre. Okay, so give a little background on the history of sci-fi. Depending on who you ask, some scholars would argue that sci-fi has been around basically ever since we've been telling stories. On the left side of the screen, you'll see an image of like an Hindu flying city tower that is from some of their ancient poetry. There's always been sort of fantastic ideas like this in a lot of our stories. Some people argue that even Gilgamesh is sci-fi, based on sort of the fantastic creatures. Some people will argue that Beowulf falls into that. Ultimately, these things are all really speculative, and because we didn't have much real science around them, I would consider these sort of work closer to fantasy, and I think that's sort of generally what people think of, but depending on how you look at it, you can call this science fiction as well. So yeah, the other kind of main school of thought is that science fiction really became possible following the scientific revolution. This makes a lot more sense. As we got more scientific with mathematics and astrology and physics, we became more interested in literature around these ideas. And of course, they're still very speculative, but it felt like it was based on something. So some of the early works that have been around for a very, very long time and have really stuck with us, being Frankenstein and 20,000 Leagues. Those are some of those early classics that kind of inspired by that scientific revolution. So how does this all tie into film? Well, considering that, science fiction has been around for such a long time, it shouldn't be too surprising that science fiction has always kind of been really deeply ingrained in film history. As you can see here, pretty much ever since film has been a thing, since the Lumiere brothers first screened their short films in 1895, we've had sci-fi. Only 7 years later, A Trip to the Moon comes out, and on the right side of your screen, you can see a still from that film, which is really a blast if you haven't seen it. There's this long cannon that shoots these astronomers out to the moon, and that is definitely more of the like science part of it. The less sciencey part of it is when they discover people on the moon. Of course, the moon has a face as well, and you still have those very sort of fantastic, hard to believe elements in sci-fi, but it's of course more rooted in what we believe to be possible. So the other thing that I really want to, distinguish here is that intellectual property has always been a really, really big part of sci-fi and film and also television, but for now, film. In 1910, there was a 14-minute film version of Frankenstein, which is a very sort of loose adaptation of the novel, but nonetheless still Frankenstein. And then only 6 years later, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea got a full-fledged feature film. So right from the get-go, there was always sort of a common motif of, taking these great sci-fi literature works and, adapting them for the big screen. So just to move into something that's a little more recent, as our science has really progressed, sci-fi has also grown and really changed a lot and become sort of this wider genre that we know it as today. I would argue, in the earlier days of sci-fi, there was much less range. There's a lot of, exploration, whether it's to the moon or the stars or underneath us, and then also sort of these like monsters and fantastical things, which are just really deeply rooted in storytelling from much earlier ages. But, as we got into the 60s, 70s, and 80s, there's just a much wider range of what sci-fi can be. So I'm just picking from this range in the 1970s because I think it's such a good way of showing that. So obviously, as we talked about, Alien is very much on the horror side. Star Wars, way more of an action adventure, big worlds. Not that Alien doesn't have new and interesting worlds, but Star Wars really kind of opened up all these different possibilities. And then Clockwork Orange is something that feels a lot more familiar to us and is more in that dystopia kind of genre, but really feels much more familiar to the world that we know. So, at this time, we're seeing all sorts of different kinds of sci-fi. This is just in the 80s, I think it's really interesting to see how both of these films are definitely a little more like family friendly and still have huge sci-fi elements to them, big, just really big ideas, but we're seeing it kind of accessible to anyone and something that anyone can relate to, which is one of the reasons that I love sci-fi so much, is that it really just has such a broad range of possibilities. So what to take away from all of this without getting too deep into the history is like, in this day and age, I think any narrative structure can really succeed, in sort of like the sci-fi lens, whether you have a drama or a romance or a comedy or, action, horror, whatever you want to do, if it has a sci-fi element, we're comfortable with the genre. We've all seen and have been familiarized with so many sci-fi movies and TV shows that you can really expect people to not be resistant to your ideas, no matter how crazy they are. I picked this image from Inception because it's one of those crazy. One, it's a really cinematic marvel how they created this shot by spinning around a giant cylinder with them in the room, but also just the fact that we were able to, have someone tell us we have these dream worlds, and depending on what's happening to the people while they're dreaming, the world can be spinning. The fact that all of us watched that, as a society, and we're like, yeah, fine, sure, I'm cool with it. It really goes a long way to show that, the audience is going to trust you and kind of run with whatever you give them. And that's one of the things that's so great about sci-fi, is we get to explore these absolutely wild worlds, and everyone's comfortable with it. Okay. That being said, I think one of the most important things to talk about, and what I want to spend a lot of time talking about today, is that in today's world, there's a really big difference between the types of films that we see that are sci-fi and the types of sci-fi TV shows that we get nowadays. Just because of the recent successes and failures of sci-fi films, I think there's a much tighter range of what kind of sci-fi is really doing in that space compared to TV, where there are a ton of really successful sci-fi shows right now that are really succeeding and kind of opening up the possibilities to what we can do in television. So more recently, when it comes to science fiction on the big screen, the industry is really moving away from tentpoles. Of course, I mentioned the superhero films just to kind of say this is how big how wide the range of sci-fi films can be. Ultimately, I think the superhero genre is kind of separate, but those films are doing very well. But there are lots of other films with underlying IP that are really struggling. On the left here is an image from Valerian and the City of a Thousand Planets. It's the most expensive independent film ever created. It cost somewhere around $180 million, and it did really poorly despite being based on intellectual property. So the recent history of big sci-fi films is that studios are constantly getting burned by these very expensive films that don't do well at the box office. If we go back, as recently to The Matrix, however, that was a film that was pretty expensive, $63 million, and it did fantastically well, and is obviously a really terrific film that we all enjoy. However, if you look at something the Wachowski siblings have done recently, Jupiter Ascending, a lot more expensive, $100 million more expensive, and almost $300 million less box office sales. So, that's both are films that are completely original without underlying intellectual property, and the landscape has really shifted. And part of that is just these films have become more expensive and even more built out than they ever have been. But there's also just not the same sort of appetite for it. Here's a few bombs that I wanted to highlight in very, very recent history. As you can see, they're all very expensive movies and they cost a ton of money. John Carter is infamous because some people will say it's the biggest bomb of all time. And, the result of this is that studios are really hesitant to get behind these big ideas, regardless of whether they have intellectual property or not, because it's a really big risk. And we also don't even know the marketing budget for these films. We have an idea of what they can estimate to be, but they're not usually released. So some of these losses might even be worse than they appear. So on the flip side, there have definitely been a lot of sci-fi successes in film. I think the big difference is that these concepts are in much more grounded worlds. So they're not these huge ideas where everything is completely different. It's that a few things are different, but the world is really familiar. I think one of the biggest advantages of this is that you only have so much time in a movie to get your ideas across. And if you only have a few things that have changed, like in Ex Machina, the world is pretty much the world we know, but we have some semblance of an actual artificial intelligence. That is easier for an audience to wrap their heads around in such a short period of time. This is just really important because you're not questioning the rules of the world, which is something we'll talk a lot about later. And on top of that, if you only change a little thing about the world, these films are also a lot cheaper, so it's a lot easier for them to do better. So I really love Ex Machina. If you haven't seen that film, go check it out. It's really terrific. And it does a lot with a little. And I guess the last thing I want to add is usually in these grounded concepts, they're not sort of a pure sci-fi where it's all about the technology and sort of adventuring into new worlds. Usually there's sort of an overlap with other genres that we feel really familiar with. The ones that we'll be talking about a lot today are horror. I think horror is a really good blend for sci-fi because it, gives you reasons to explain why something that maybe seems magical almost in this awfulness is happening. So with that, we'll talk about a few successes that kind of fall into this. A Quiet Place and Bird Box don't necessarily, I would say, scream science fiction, but at the end of the day, you have monsters that we don't have an explanation for, but we know that they're not magical. We know that they're rooted in some kind of pseudo-scientific logic to it. So those films do really well, of course, because there's a lot of tension and we care so much about what happens to these characters, whether they live or die. And it's not so much about the monsters and how the monsters work and like what the world is like. We're really rooting for these people to survive and we become emotionally attached to them. More recently, Invisible Man was an absolutely massive success. I believe that film cost $7 million and it made 122 before, unfortunately, all of us ended up in the situation that we're in right now. That's a film where really everything about our world is the same except for this one thing, which of course is that this man has developed a suit that allows him to become invisible. I would say the through line with all of these movies is that even though there are big ideas happening in the background that qualify as science fiction, we're extremely invested in these characters. We're learning things about, what it means to be human, usually what it means to love, or, what it feels like. In The Invisible Man, it does such a good job of, trying to describe to us what it can feel like to be in an abusive relationship. So all of these films just do a really good job of, finding common humanity for everybody and making us feel really connected to these characters, even though there are these huge ideas at play. So to tie this all into writing, I would say if you have an idea for something that's science fiction that, is pretty much the world we live in, film is a really good place to turn. If you have a big idea for a huge world that's so different from the world that we know and that has massive implications on how everyone acts, I think TV is the place to turn to. So here you'll see I have a couple screenshots from shows recently that I think do this very well. We'll be talking about a few others. So Upload, I'll try not to spoil anything. Upload is a show where we're slightly in the future from now, but the big change is that if someone is dying, they have the option of uploading themselves to a digital afterlife in the hopes that they'll be able to be downloaded into a clone version of their own bodies later. Obviously, that is a really big idea that needs a lot of explaining and a lot of world building. There's a ton of possibilities with this. First, you have to explain how you get uploaded. Then, of course, it's what does that world, once you're uploaded, look like? What are the rules of that world? Can we do anything? Are there limitless possibilities? These are ideas that I think are really hard to explain if you only have 2 hours. So TV is a great place to say, hey, we're going to explore all of this world. You're going to get to see all the little edges of it. And it gives you an opportunity to kind of think about it in a more in-depth way. Watchmen, which this is a screenshot on the left here, is another great example of this. We have superheroes with magical powers and advanced weaponry and just a lot of things that are not the same about our world that, Zack Snyder tried to explain those things in a short amount of time with Watchmen the film. It was not well received. The show, on the other hand, I think does very well because we don't have to learn everything about it right away. We can explore slowly through the story and learn how things operate over time. And on the far right, I have a screen cap of Nick Offerman and Devs, which is a show that also came out recently on Hulu. Very interesting show. Again, it takes a really huge idea that one is philosophical and secondly is sci-fi. And instead of hitting you over the head with it right away, you come to understand what all of those philosophies are about over time. And that really expands the meaning of the show. So all in all, I would say if you're trying to write a brand new world that's rooted in science, TV is the way to go. Okay, so these next few sections I want to talk about how you should approach writing your sci-fi and how you shouldn't approach writing your sci-fi. So I think one of the most important things and one of the hardest things to do when you're writing a sci-fi is to release your information slowly. So what that means essentially is you have the rules to the world and you understand how it works. But it's really important not to overload your reader with all of that information, with all of those rules. You may feel that you need to because things are too crazy, too different from the world that we live in, but some of that mystery is actually a really, really powerful tool that you can use in your favor to generate suspense and intrigue and mystery for your story. So on the top left here, we have a screen cap from A Quiet Place. This is actually, this photo is, this shot is often made fun of because it sort of hits you over the head with the idea that I'm talking about. Primarily the section here that says, what is the weakness to the monsters in that film? This is a very blunt way of saying that part of the mystery of the movie is that we don't know how the creatures can be defeated. This is a really big plot point in the film as the family discovers how to ward off the monsters over time. But it's a really good way to sort of keep your audience invested because you are trying to figure it out on the same level as the characters. You're very connected to the characters because you also don't have a good idea of how to survive. On the bottom screen, we have a screen cap from this season of Westworld. I'll try not to spoil the show again. I say this not a spoiler because early on in Westworld we know that Dolores is a host and made up of robot parts. But one of the things that season 1 of Westworld does really, really well is it avoids answering sort of the big questions that you might have about the world in favor of spending time on the characters and developing them and their emotional arcs and their relationships. One example of this is in season 1 of Westworld, we don't know where the parks actually are. They never tell us where it is in the bigger world, how it relates to the bigger world. We could be on another planet. It might all be a simulation. Westworld might not exist. that is something that really kept people sort of thinking all the way until season 2, which was 2 years afterwards. And it's something that keeps your audience invested. And you don't need to tell them because it's not necessary, it's not critical to the story. We can understand what Dolores is struggling with without knowing where they are. Similarly, we don't know the exact timelines in season 1 of which characters are where and how they know each other. And that actually keeps us watching because we want to know, are they going to tell us how everything lines up? They could have explained all of this stuff right away and it wouldn't have worked as well because it would just feel, it wouldn't be character motivated, it would be plot motivated. Just to add on to this, you know, it's really important to realize that not every idea in your script needs to be explained, despite how cool the world is. So again, this falls into the intrigue, but this also falls into that sort of category of the, you know, the audience really trusting you. So on the left is a screenshot from Watchmen. One of the characters in Watchmen is the smartest person in the world. He happens to be sort of a superhero. His name is Ozymandias. And one of the things he does is he teleports squids that he's created out of his lab around the world. And that's a really big idea. That has a lot of weird implications that if you really start to think about it, it's kind of crazy. Can people teleport anywhere? Is there any sort of backside, you know, any sort of bad thing about teleporting that we don't realize? How does he create these squids? You know, how did he create this teleporter? You can go on forever. The show ignores that. The show says, you know, we're not going to tell you the ins and outs of this. It's just going to happen. And what's funny is like this world is so vibrant and different and crazy that it's fine. It fits in with what we know. We don't really question it. And that's a really important thing to remember as a writer. Sometimes you may have a great idea that is so big, you feel that you need to explain it, but really the audience will trust you. As long as there is a consistency and an internal logic that you know, it's going to be fine. People are not going to question it. On the right is a screen cap from The Invisible Man. This is Elizabeth Moss's character going into the room where the suit is kept. This is another really good example of this. She interacts with the technology in the suit, but we're not shown like how exactly it works or how it was built or like what's the deal with this kind of like weird closet for the suit. None of that stuff is logicked out to us, and it's fine because we've been in this movie for enough time already that we've accepted the fact that there's a suit that makes someone go invisible. Even though it's our world and it should have to be based in our technology, we just run with it. So it's just really important to remember that the audience is going to trust you implicitly, and you have a lot of leeway with that. When you explain rules, it should be something only that furthers the plot and helps us explain character more. So this is maybe the most important thing. I think people who write sci-fi, myself included, we love getting sucked into the worlds that we create and all of the possibilities and how cool it is that we have this technology that is really powerful and can change everything. However, that's not why people like to watch anything. People like to watch not because we have, you know, news stories to tell or anything. It's because they are invested in the story and most importantly, the characters. Watchmen is a really terrific example of this because the main character of Watchmen, her name is Sister Knight or Angela Abar. She is not actually in the comics or the Zack Snyder film. Damon Lindelof took the world of Watchmen and didn't just say, okay, we're going to continue along this route. He thought, here's a world I have that I want this to take place in. Who is the best person for conflict with this story? And that ended up being someone who was not in the source material. So he made sure that there was a reason that this world and this character had to be connected. And it helped reveal something about the character, it helped us reveal something about humanity. They were not disparate pieces. It wasn't just, a detective drama in a sci-fi world. It was someone who was going to suffer from, a particular set of conflicts because of the way that world is built. So it's really important before you start, writing any pages, it's how can I create a character that is going to generate the most conflict within this story, within this world, with the other characters that maybe you already have. To add on to this, I think it's really important to explore different relationships to the sci-fi ideas you have in your story. Not everyone is going to view the technology in the same way. And I think that is usually a really big source of conflict within these kinds of stories. On the left is a screen cap from Devs. I don't want to spoil too much of the show. Philosophically, it's about free will. Some characters believe we do have free will, others don't believe we have free will. Obviously, there's technology that's related to that idea of free will, but again, I don't want to spoil it. So what the show does so well is it says, we have people who are on opposite sides of this, and that's going to be our sort of like story engine, and our conflict for the show is how those people relate to each other and how they relate to the technology. On the right, again, we have Westworld. This is from season 2. This is one of the creators of Westworld, Ford, with one of the robots, Maeve. This show, there's tons of different ways to look at this from, but of course, Ford, during the episodes of Westworld, Ford has come to believe that the hosts are, approximate to human beings, that they deserve to be alive and be free just like the rest of us. There are other characters who believe that hosts don't deserve that hosts are not on the same level as humans, that they don't have a soul, they don't deserve to exist. So that is, again, a really big conflict in the story. And it's sort of tied to free will again, which is definitely a common theme of sci-fi, is like, do we have control over our lives, or is there something bigger controlling us? Okay, so the next writing to do is, I think it's really important to be able to explain more or less why now. Why sci-fi? At the end of the day, this is circling back to some stuff I've said already. Science fiction is just a way of connecting us to our common humanity. It's not about saying, oh, look how cool this technology is and everything we can create is so interesting and game-changing or scary. Science fiction is really trying to reveal something about the way we use technology and ultimately how we behave. So there's so many different avenues to go down with that. Ultimately, I would say, considering how much technology is a part of our lives now, it should be usually pretty easy to say why now. Many of these ideas, whether in Westworld it's AI, those things feel like they're close to happening in our world. And it's important for us to sort of wonder, what does it mean to be alive? What does it mean to be human? What other life form, what do we consider to be something that is conscious and has thoughts? So this is super, super important. At the end of the day, because sci-fi can be kind of a part of any story, you need to be able to justify why this is a sci-fi and why your story doesn't just take place in the world that we live in today. Okay, so here's the part that maybe some people won't be thrilled about, but coming from that sort of representation background, I think it's really important to talk about understanding the sci-fi market, which is why we discussed, box office a little bit before and just kind of the landscape of film. So again, before we get to writing pages, I think it's incredibly important to ask yourself, is this story best suited for film or television. I think we've covered this a decent amount, but just to reiterate, if you have this huge world that is completely different from ours, flying cars and teleportation and aliens everywhere, and we live on a different planet, that's probably a story that is not going to do super well in the film marketplace these days. Alternatively, if you have a story that feels pretty contained, but just has one interesting, science fiction device, maybe that is better for film. On the flip side of this, I think it's also really important to have good expectations for what you want this script to be. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to sell anything. I think we're all super familiar with that, for better or for worse. And I think it's important to know, am I trying to do something that shows what a talented writer I am, how big of a world I can create, the big ideas I have, or something that says, I am really ready to take on other jobs and show that I do the little things right that the great writers do. This can be tricky, but I think it's important to know that it's very difficult. It's a very difficult marketplace to break in as a writer, and you need to have an idea of what you're trying to achieve with the script. If you're trying to get representation is really different from trying to sell something. And I think the sort of ideas that lend themselves to creating a great sample aren't always things that are going to do super well in the marketplace. There are many, many stories about sci-fi writers in particular creating really beautiful worlds and writing terrific scripts that can't get made because they're too expensive. It's a big risk for a studio or production company to take under, but because they showed, really solid writing fundamentals, they got hired for other jobs based off of that. So I think it's really important to understand that the sci-fi market is extremely difficult. And okay. So we're going to do some writing don'ts. A lot of these are based on my own experience reading scripts as a creative exec, but then also writing sci-fi myself and notes that I've gotten from other people. So this can be sort of minor, but I think it's really important not to get bogged down in the details. What that means, and this is something I think is really important with those big world building ideas. It just means that you are not explaining every little aspect of your world. So if you're doing something that's on that sort of Star Wars epic scale, on the page you're not writing about how the flying cars work and how the doors open and how people call each other and what it's like to go on the internet. I have read things where writers try to explain how each facet of the world works. Ultimately, that becomes very hard to read. It can be, I think we're all familiar with the feeling of reading a long chunk of text and really struggling with that. And that's what it can feel like to read a sci-fi that is focusing too much on the little details. So I would say be really specific about what you need the reader to know, which goes back to, you know the rules of your world, but the audience doesn't need to know all of them. And to understand what you need them, what's critical for them to make sense of the world and what's not. The other important thing about this, the other big thing to note about this is that when you leave out those details, you're actually allowing the reader to imagine the world in their mind's eye. They're not constrained by what you've written on the page. That may feel counterintuitive, but ultimately, reading or writing a script is a collaborative process between the person who's writing it and the person who's reading it. And you want them to feel some ownership over what you've created. When you leave out details about how the flying cars work or how the guns, whether the guns shoot plasma or bullets, the reader is going to come up with their own answers and they're going to feel more connected to your script. So it's a really good way to make things feel more real, because ultimately people will fill in those details for you. And that's a win. So bottom line, stick to the bare necessities, keep what you must. Another really important thing about the rules is, to figure them all out ahead of time. Don't make it up as you go. Again, not everyone needs to know what your rules are, but there needs to be consistency, because the second you contradict yourself or do something that makes the reader feel like they've been cheated, all the trust that you have that is innately given to you by being a writer and being a part of our shared film history is gone. So it's extremely important to make sure that you have consistency and that everything that the characters do and the tech does makes sense within the world. Lastly, this is the most important of the don'ts, is don't lose the focus on your characters. No matter how cool the ideas are, we, again, are in it for that human connection. We love seeing ourselves on screen and feeling a bond or a kinship with the characters. So even if you have the best idea in the world, or what you think is the best idea in the world, the unfortunate truth is that there isn't a new or original idea in storytelling. What's important is the perspective you bring. And the perspective you bring is based on your own human experience, and that needs to show up in your writing. It's, again, about that common humanity. What should we learn about ourselves when we're reading? You have to remember that it's a device. Sometimes in horror, you talk about sort of a love triangle between the main character, a love interest, and the monster. Sometimes sci-fi is also like that, in the sense that instead of a monster, you have sci-fi. And there's this love triangle that, may seem like it's very plot-based, but really that connection between the protagonist and the monster, the protagonist and the sci-fi, is really just showing us what's wrong with the protagonist, or, what we should be taking away from, what we should take away from the story as a theme. So this is definitely the most important thing, is to not get caught up in the ideas for the world, and remember that you have to have compelling characters to really draw us in. So that's the end of the lecture section. I'm really excited to do the Q&A. I'm gonna go grab Mary and let you know when we're ready.
All right, we're back. Hi, Mary.
Hello.
Welcome. Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, of course.
That was really cool, Andrew. Thank you so much. So we have a couple questions. I also have some myself as they keep rolling in. So you touched on this a little bit, but I would love, the first question touches on not really sure what grounded sci-fi means. Will you talk about, like, when, there's so many forms of sci-fi, but there's the grounded sci-fi movement. What do you think that means? Like, what does that conjure up for you both?
I would say personally that grounded sci-fi, again, is an idea that is really based in the world that we live in. There's just one change, one step forward technologically that isn't really something that's not going to change our world upside down. Just to go back to The Invisible Man, that world that Elizabeth Moss's character lives in is pretty much the world that we know. The one difference is that we have this like crazy camera suit that makes you go invisible. But you don't need to be explained all the rules of the world, because you know that this is our world. Anything you want to add?
No, I think speaking for the lens of having worked on Upload, it's all of those qualities that Andrew just described. And our focus was more, it was like speculative science, like the show's creator was really trying to predict science based on research he had done, rather than kind of like grabbing like a novel idea out of thin air. It was trying to be a little bit more predictive than like purely imaginative. So I think it's connected to what Andrew's saying. It's like subtle changes, or a change based off of some conceivably realistic underlying idea.
Cool. This is a great question from Tony that I was also thinking. What do you how do you guys define the difference between like sci-fi and fantasy in terms of sometimes sci-fi is clearly science fiction based in science or speculative science, and sometimes it's like, well, what if this is our reality? You know, what if it's just really similar but it's kind of different, but there isn't necessarily an explanation of it, it's just a new world that we live in? Do you call that sci-fi? Do you call that fantasy? Just love your takes on that.
I'll let you take that one first.
I don't think I quite understand the question. What's the definition?
Yeah, so the question was just between sci-fi and fantasy, but this was actually something I thought of, or I had also thought of, and so a couple examples that I came up with were like Russian Doll or Good Place. Like obviously those are sort of comedy first, at least they were nominated as such, but they're like not necessarily worlds that require some sort of technological element we don't have, but they also aren't fantastical worlds we don't recognize. Do you know what I mean? Like, so where do you see that kind of like distinction between science fiction versus the fantasy element?
They both definitely tackle philosophical issues, but I think those two shows that you listed, I've seen all of both of those two shows. I think they're more caught up in like the unknown or like mystical elements of things. And to me, I think that's where the departure lies. Like within the world of any science fiction show, I think there's like a science-based logic to how anything operates. And so for those, yeah, I think those might be more like thematically linked to like horror, I would say, where they're very caught up in like, it's more like mysticism and the religion and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I agree with that answer. I think that's really smart. I haven't seen Russian Doll, so I can't speak to that. But with A Good Place, I would say that because there's an idea of an afterlife, there isn't science behind that. It's closer to magic. I'm totally spacing on his name. Ted Danson's character is a mystical being whose magic powers the things he can create. The answer I was going to sort of go off of that is probably too specific. Is like anything that is like the way these new things happen is through magic, that falls into fantasy. So I would say like anything that's using electricity, gears, robots, metal, like that's science fiction. And something that's like, oh, well, we have this special power in our blood that allows us to fly, that, that's fantasy.
Cool. Here's a question from Erica. When it comes to a sci-fi pilot, is less more when you're trying to set up the world? Or do fans expect more because oftentimes that's the attraction?
Great question. Again, I'm going to say less is more. Part of the reason I say that is if you're creating something big, even though I'm telling you less is more, you're still going to have a lot because you're still working to put all the things that are absolutely necessary. So it's really important to make sure that you pare it down to just the things that you need to create this whole world, which is still going to be a lot. That's what I would say.
Can I add one thing there?
Absolutely.
So like, I think one thing people will be looking at is, and this is across all genres, is your ability to use words economically. So like Andrew said, you're going to have a lot of interesting components, but if you can like in a sophisticated way, like just have little glimpses of it to like pepper in details that collectively feel like they're evocative of this different world, that's going to come across as like way more sophisticated writing than like hitting people over the head with like visuals or trying to wow people when it doesn't have as much of a when it doesn't factor so heavily on the story, because like the pilot moves quickly and yeah, I mean it's character first, story first, and all of that stuff has to be in service of that story. So it's a little bit of both, but like I guess that's like the nuts and bolts way to execute it.
So this question is, when you think of the horror aspects, when do you think horror aspects negate the script being considered sci-fi? And if so, how would you market it? Like, this is specifically from Drake G, but he has a script that has both elements of sci-fi, but it's slightly more horror. So I was just curious, like, when do you lead with that element?
Okay, so I think I understand that question. it sounds like you're writing a it sounds like you're writing a horror script that explains what's scary through the sci-fi. So I would say you want to market that as a horror script. You're trying to, your main goal in entertaining the reader is to scare them, not wow them with the idea of the scary thing that you created. So it sounds like a horror script to me.
Cool. And then, okay, great. Then this question is, do you have any works in progress up your sleeve that you want to tease for us, either of you?
I'll do it because it's good practice.
Yeah.
I have my first pitch meetings this upcoming week with producers for an animated series about a girl who finds out that she was adopted. And then that info is compounded with the info that her birth parents are extraterrestrials who happen to be the most famous rock band in the universe. So yeah, a little bit of sci-fi. I guess I got the bug a little bit from my experience on Upload and getting into genre bending a little bit more.
On my end, I am not working on a sci-fi thing right now, but the last pilot I wrote was a big sci-fi world that revolved around the philosophy of transhumanism, which is sort of a real belief about turning ourselves into cyborgs. That way we can become more perfect and closer to God. So that was a really fun experience for me. Definitely really tricky to balance sort of those big world building ideas while still making it very easy to read. And yeah, just to tie it into what I was talking about, I had to spend a lot of time kind of carefully paring down the details and rules that I wanted to share with people based on feedback.
Since both of you were talking, this sort of goes into a question I had. When it comes to pitching sci-fi, or at least as you're preparing to pitch sci-fi, there's obviously a huge difference based on what you said, Andrew, between TV and film, like where the focus lies. So when it comes to pitching those, do you have any tips or suggestions of like, how do you even, world build, especially in a lot of times with emerging writers in a truncated amount of time? You don't get the glorious 20 minutes, perhaps you get maybe 10. Do you have any tips or tricks on what to focus on, how to help make your sci-fi pitch stand out?
Sure, yeah. Well, I have the benefit to, for me, it's primarily a comedy. So I get to keep a lot of those traditional wisdoms of what's the conflict among members of the ensemble that's going to keep going and sustain the series, and why are these characters funny? So for me, that's mostly what I get to focus on. And then the sci-fi is it's as cuckoo bananas as I want it to be, because it takes place on this made up version of Area 51 and plus outer space. I'm not trying to be an egghead about this at all. But I think even if it were a drama, I think basically you want to showcase why these characters you're focusing on are the most interesting window into this world. So I think to lead with world building might be a little bit I don't think I would advise that. I think I would lead with tease the world a little bit, but why is this the most compelling entryway into it? Because I feel like we were discussing this, most ideas have probably been pitched in some variety or another. So the way to make it stand out is showcasing a character with a really interesting relationship with the world, or a really interesting point of view within that world.
Totally. I completely agree. Couldn't have said better myself.
Cool. What film festivals are your favorite to target or submit to or attend for sci-fi content? Do you have any?
Wow, that's a great question.
Didn't you say that is Fantastic Fest sci-fi? Or?
Yeah, that's a really good point. There's so many factors that go into. One, I would want to ask this person whether we're talking about scripts or films. But at least for films, I think Fantastic Fest in Austin is a really good festival to go to. That is sort of more of a genre film festival, but definitely has some really interesting sci-fi stuff. Fantasia as well. I think that's pretty good. Let me see. If you really want to go big, I think Sitges, which I've been to in Spain, is one of the biggest genre festivals in Europe. Definitely a really cool place to be where there's a lot of great films. But ultimately, I don't think either of us are incredibly familiar with sort of the sci-fi film festival landscape.
Yeah, I do think a lot of places will program blocks based on genre, so it might depend on what kind of like applicants they get for any given year, but I think that there are like little niches carved out within broader festivals.
Yeah. And just to add, if you're trying to look up Sitges, it's spelled Sitges. Might be hard to find without that. So there you go.
I have an upload specific question, actually.
Sure.
It's interesting because we're on the last episode. We'll finish it tonight. It's been great. If people aren't watching it yet, definitely watch it. Awesome show. But what was interesting to me is that the pilot was almost twice as long as the rest of the episodes, which I just hadn't seen. I know you can mess around more with form in the streaming space. But I was expecting a half-hour, like comedy-esque, sci-fi, and the first episode was longer than that. And I just was like looking it up to confirm, and you would know anyway, but it's like 46 minutes. And then after that, they're around the 28 mark or something, max. So would you talk a little about like the pitching process or, the benefit of that?
Okay, first of all, great eye. Yes. There was a big gap between the pilot shooting and then the season shooting. And so I think he was sort of like leaving a little bit of flexibility open for himself, like leaving that door open to play with form a little bit more. There was a lot of talk about like maybe the scripts for 9 and 10 were going to be shot together as like a jumbo finale episode. So it was a little bit loosey-goosey there. But I think one thing that you're keying into is truly like how hard it is to structure a pilot. So this was his first departure from like a 22-minute sitcom. Like his bread and butter, if you guys know, like was stuff like The Office, Parks and Rec, The Simpsons, King of the Hill, like just so formulaic network comedies. And so in trying to integrate, romance, drama, thriller, comedy, sci-fi, mystery, and trying to integrate all of those, there is world building you have to do. There is like character specific humor you have to do. There's so much to get done in such a small amount of real estate. So for those of you who are doing more traditional sci-fi, you get to benefit from like a full, how long is an hour-long pilot? I don't even know.
60 pages.
60-page script. And then, in Greg's case, he sort of split the difference. With what I do, it's all like definitely sub 35-page count. So yeah, I think it just points to how much work there was to be done in introing this world.
I thought it was so cool. I was like, but I also will say for emerging writers, you probably can't get away with pitching that. Like you definitely need to have clout to be like, pilot's going to be like 40, but after that's a half hour. People will.
Right.
Cool. I don't see any other questions. Anybody else have anything? Thoughts?
Covered it all.
I know, it was really thorough and really, really awesome. Really, really cool. So thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I guess we're out of questions. Yeah, that was really cool. Thanks so much.
Let me pop in.
Yeah, thank you for coming, Ray.
Yeah.
All right, everybody. Well, get those imaginations flowing and get back to writing.